Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Talking TWAMPs. My name is Blake, and today we will be discussing gerrymandering, that wonderful political age-old practice. But before we get into that, we'll go through some brief introductions. As I mentioned, my name is Blake, and I'm a government major and a German major here at the college, and I will throw you over to my left.
Hi, my name is George. I'm a IR and RPSS major at the college.
My name is Jakob. I'm tired, and I have some opinions. Let's go.
And I'm Joe. I'm bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and I'm also ready to go.
All right. Well, thank you all for being here today. Let's get into it. So, gerrymandering, a practice that is not foreign to any government, but especially not to ours, and one that takes its own particular form in U.S. politics, especially since states are in charge of drawing those borders, so it's not as if the national government is dictating that policy. But one can imagine that they might, even if they could. So, to that end, where do we see the most egregious examples of gerrymandering? Is it particular states? Do they have particular leanings? Who seems to be using it most and why?
Well, do we want to start with a brief description by somebody of what we're talking about?
Yeah, sure. So gerrymandering, we're talking about, of course, the practice of drawing districts for representatives, especially those for the U.S. House of Representatives and for state houses, drawing districts in such a way as to prejudice them towards one party or another. Often they do this by packing a lot of people who vote for one party into a single district, or cracking, in other words, taking little parts of a heavily partisan area off into majority the other party districts in order to reduce the political influence there. The point is that this is a practice that doesn't occur, it's not an accident. Parties sit down and they say, this is our strategy. We want to form districts in certain ways in order to see certain outcomes. And that intention is really what separates gerrymandering from, for instance, a district in New York is likely to be heavily blue, but that's not gerrymandered. That's just a product of the population.
Yeah, the technical term is also malapportionment.
Well, malapportionment, though, can also mean other things. And we'll talk, I guess, at some point about the Senate and the
House.
Yeah.
As it happens, but.
So, with that succinct definition of gerrymandering under our belts, where do we see it? Who seems to practice it the most? Not necessarily parties, but regions, perhaps, or states. Where do we see gerrymandering occur most actively?
Well, I would say that the most fertile places for gerrymandering tend to be in medium-sized states which have heavily partisan areas. In other words, highly polarized states.
Some recent examples, Maryland went to the Supreme Court because it was heavily favoring the Democrats.
Heavily is a strong word, and we can get into the degrees of gerrymandering.
It was statistically significantly favoring the Democrats, and of course in Texas, I think they are being litigated right now. They have some districts which seem to overly favor Republicans. So,
in fact, yeah, let's use those examples to talk about the two definitions that you gave, Jacob, the packing and cracking, the two types of gerrymandering. If you're interested, I'd say, and you guys can add other examples if you think necessary. A good example of cracking is the congressional districts around San Antonio, in which the blue areas of the city are sort of brought out in districts with the heavily Republican countryside.
If you look at a map, it's almost, there are these giant rural districts, and they have little tendrils that go into the city. Yeah.
The same is true of some Republican areas in Maryland. And a good example of packing is from my home area of northern Ohio. There's this lovely district, I think it's the 9th, but I'm not sure, called the Mistake by the Lake. And what they did is they essentially drew a boundary which just goes around the border of Lake Erie to grab both Toledo and the western parts of Cleveland to sort of pack all these heavily Democratic areas into one district. So it's a safe, a completely safe district, which allows more flippable areas to be moved into other districts.
Fair enough. So we're looking at polarized states or states that have densely packed areas of one party bordering flippable areas of another. And so, of course, we can all see that this leads to different parties fighting over the ability to draw these district lines. Before we get into how do we solve what some see as a problem and what some see as an element of just the way democracy works, how does this ability of state legislatures to form these districts to potentially pack and or crack change the way that politics happens in the U.S.? Does it make state legislatures more important than they could be, or does it mean that there's a certain strategy that some parties follow while others do not? Let's just get into how that changes political behavior in this country.
Well, one thing it does do, I think, is suppress voting in a lot of districts. If you're in a district that has been packed so that it is going to overwhelmingly vote for your party, then your vote it's not really going to affect the election. And the same thing for cracked districts. If you are in the vast minority of your district because you've been kind of slipped out into a kind of outcropping, then you're less likely to participate. And I think that is, in my opinion at least, anti-democratic, in the most basic sense of reducing democratic participation.
Well, the other example, which is often the one that's criticized by activist groups, is that it results in disproportionate results between votes and who actually gets represented. I think the example brought up earlier was Maryland, which I think is roughly a 60-40 state, but sends 6 Democrats and 1 Republican to the House of Representatives. Another example, which I think is currently being litigated, if I'm not mistaken, is North Carolina's map. North Carolina is pretty close to a 50-50 split. It's a swing state, but overwhelmingly sends Republicans for a similar reason.
Fair enough. Okay, so I think it would be interesting for us to see a little bit of debate in this topic on how whether or not we believe that gerrymandering is inherently something that needs to be solved. But even if we have unanimity on this panel of the fact that it's something that needs to be changed, if not quote unquote solved, how do we go about that? Is there a way? Are there competing standards?
So there are 2 basic strategies to correct gerrymandering, right? One is we keep the political system we have, the way we send representatives, the way we divide up where they're sent from, but we find a way to draw the districts fairly. We just redraw them, and that gets very complicated very fast, obviously. And the other way is much more radical, but we transform our political system. We move to proportional representation or, somewhere else. But those are the 2 basic strategies. Of course, one is more practical than the other, but I'm sure we'll get into that.
Okay, so let's say that we decide to go with the former option, that we keep the way that we vote and elect our representatives and what the proportionality is, but we decide that we're going to change the way that we draw the districts. How do we make sure that it is quote-unquote fair, the way that we draw these districts?
Well, there are a lot of ways to do it. One of the arguments against such things, and one of the things that complicates this, is the desire to create majority-minority districts, which I believe is required by the Voting Rights Act in certain cases. So in that case, if you're trying to create a district which is majority-minority, which will likely send a minority representative to Congress, that in some cases requires a gerrymandered district. There is a district in Chicago, which I don't remember the number of, but people can look it up, which is like this, which is sort of like it takes a little clump from the north of the city and then runs down like 3-4 meters across down a highway to get to another clump. And it's one of the ugliest districts in the country, but the reason it's drawn that way is so that the city can send a Hispanic representative to Congress. So, this is one of the things that complicates the drawing of districts. You want fair districts, sure, but what that means is in question.
So who then goes about selecting these fair districts? How? Because right now the way that I understand that it occurs is that we have congressmen who propose maps, which are then voted on, and then they become law. If there is some other way that we can be drawing these maps, how do we make them fair?
If I'm not mistaken, it's the state legislatures that determine.
Sorry, I meant state congressmen. Fair enough. State legislators.
So, it is generally, I think, in all 50 states, the duty of the state legislature, as you said. But in a lot of, I won't say a lot of states, in some states, whether by a decision of the Supreme Court or by their own decision, they hand off that power to a commission, basically. And I know in Virginia that commission is partisan, and so because the Republicans have controlled the Virginia State House, the Republicans essentially drew Virginia's representative lines. But in other states, they specifically make it a nonpartisan commission, and often what they'll do is they'll get demographic experts, people who understand kind of the sociological implications of the districts, people, some political scientists who are not politicians, and they all sit down and they say, okay, what's the best way to get everybody in the state fairly represented? And that, in my opinion, is the best solution if we're not going to see a radical reform of the political system. But it's hard, right? It's hard to get a party who is in control in a state legislature to say, no, we're not going to take advantage of that. We're going to see that people are fairly represented. And of course, it also doesn't help that those lines are only redrawn every 10 years, right, at the census. And so that kind of complicates it further.
So let's imagine for a minute that one of us is sitting on this commission. I know that there's a little bit of a debate even around the word fair and what that looks like, and I'd like to see if we've got any strong opinions around the table. There's an active debate as to whether or not fair means that it's proportional to the population of the state. Joe, you mentioned that Maryland is something like 60-40 Democrat-Republican. Does that mean that out of their 7 representatives, the least gerrymandered system sends, 4 Democrats and 3 Republicans? Or does fair mean that all of the districts look as diverse as the state is? Or does it mean that all of the districts or that there's a district that's rural that represents the rural area and a district that's urban that represents the urban area? What does fair, even by the standards of a third-party commission that has no political stake, what does fair look like when those lines are drawn?
It's a good question, and I think the question gets to the root at what you mean when you say representative democracy. Because you're right, when people look at gerrymandering in the mainstream, I would say that most people thinking about ideological representation. So people are saying, like the example I said, there are so many Republicans, and Republicans are underrepresented in the Maryland delegation. And one of the obvious solution to that is what Jakob said, the radical solution of proportional representation, which is exactly what you said. Just everybody votes in the state. You get X percent Republicans, you get X percent legislatures. And if I'm not mistaken, they do that in a lot of countries for national representation. I believe Germany has a mixed system which includes that. Many countries do that. The problem with that is that sacrifices local representation, as you were saying, because you just have to have a party list. So at this point, I hate to bring up this word again because this is going to annoy Blake, but it does get down to what your subjective view of what a representative democracy should look like. I am tempted personally, and this is where I expect to see some disagreement. While I am tempted by the sort of ideological representation aspect, I value more highly the sort of regional aspect of it. I think even if you don't have perfect ideological representation, what's more important is that you have somebody who knows an area who can represent it nationally. And so that's why the solution that I favor is actually computer-generated districts. They have formulas which can sort of, using the county lines, minimize the dispersion of a district, concentrate it as compactly as possible around a given center of population. And I think that's the most objective way that these districts can be drawn to fit my subjective value of it.
And you brought up the question of whether ideological representation should kind of form a basis for fairness in how districts are formed. And obviously, the party system is not constitutionally enshrined. So is there really a constitutional basis for ideological representation as such? And I think the answer is no. If you look at a state like, for instance, Virginia, where we're relatively close, Democrat and Republican, I think in the last presidential election, it was barely outside the margin of error on the state election. But we send 2 Democratic senators, and we consider the Senate a representative institution, malapportioned though it may be between rural and urban states. But we consider that representation. And so I agree, we have to be careful when we talk about ideological representation being a baseline. But of course, when we're talking about computer algorithms, I mean, that's really just passing off the problem, Then who gets to design these algorithms? Who gets to choose which one we implement? Ultimately, it comes back to whoever's in control of the state legislature. And that's where I think the role of the Supreme Court has become more important recently, where they have been going back to states and saying, this is unacceptable. And we're not going to tell you how to draw the districts, but you got to do it differently. I think actually there was one case where a state redrew its districts, in North Carolina, I believe, and took the redrawn districts to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, do it again. You messed up. So I think there's an important role of national government, federal government, to play in kind of moderating the excesses of the states.
So that is, I think, and Joe mentioned, you mentioned offhand the second possibility, but I think that was a fairly good discussion of our first possibility, which is we keep the way that we elect our representatives, but we change the way that the districts are drawn. I'd like to have a slightly broader conversation on what you touched on, Joe, that idea of we say forget it. There's no way to fairly draw this. Jacob, you mentioned even if we defer it to the computers, who gets to write the programs? Okay, so maybe we throw it to a bipartisan district or a bipartisan commission. But what if all the commissioners are of some party, but their expertise lend them well to the commission? So we decide no, this process is far too complicated, and there's an actual real national movement to change the way that districts get drawn in states. And there's an amendment passed, and now we're in proportional representation. That there's an entirely new system about how we get elected. Do we foresee benefits to such a change, or perhaps even pitfalls to such a change? Joe, I think you touched on a couple tangentially, but maybe if we could flesh those out a little bit.
Besides the, obviously getting ideological representation, the number one benefit of proportional representation, in my view, is increased ideological diversity. It would depend on exactly how you draw it, but if you had a proportional representation system, you could have big states send, even with the current vote counts, sending third-party delegates to Congress, which I think could be useful in a time of political polarization, and that possibility would also encourage, further diversification of the ideological options, let's call it that, available to us in this country.
Conversely, though, couldn't that increase political polarity, or not polarity, polarization, as a result of say those states, those rural states that do enjoy malapportionment, they would be they'd be very hurt by the fact that they had lost that advantage, and that would possibly make them even more resentful of the fact that they had lost that, and then they would perhaps galvanize to be even stronger to try to keep whatever gains that they could in a equal apportionment system.
Well, I think we have a good case study in Europe, at least, between Germany and Great Britain. Germany, which of course uses a kind of hybrid system, but for our purposes, it is proportional representation, at least in one of its houses. And Great Britain, which of course sends members from districts exclusively. And in Great Britain, you have two parties. There are third parties, but much as in the US, they don't have real political pull. Except for the regional parties, but that's kind of their own funny thing. And in Great Britain, there is considerable political polarization, despite the fact that they have our kind of system, sending members from districts. Conversely, in Germany, while there are kind of peripheral parties, even large peripheral parties that are politically polarized and at the extreme ends, the two main parties of Germany and the ones that have been forming the government for as long as anybody's been alive, well, for as long as the Republic of Germany has been alive in its current form, they are relatively centrist and much more prone to compromise than anything that we're familiar with in the U.S. So I think just from that kind of anecdotal evidence, and I'm sure from other proportional system representation systems, I think it really does encourage people to come towards the center, at least for the main parties.
I'd agree, and while I agree with you, I think there might be some grievance coming out of the reform itself. I think once that settled down, one of the other major advantages of proportional representation, which is another thing that I like about it, is that every vote counts in a way that it doesn't necessarily in our current system. In that gerrymandering is only possible because we have a first past the post system, in that once you get to 50% plus one vote, the rest of the votes, one way or another, don't really matter. And so if you can get that 50% plus one, you don't have to appeal across the aisle, which I think is one of the things that's driving the polarization on both sides, that Congress people in both districts only have to worry about, in both kinds of districts, only have to worry about a primary challenge, and so they go as far left or as far right as they can. In Germany, on the other hand, if I understand it correctly, because every 5% is another congressperson or legislator or whatever they call them, there's a real political benefit to moderation in a sense that there really isn't in the United States. Would you all agree with that?
That's not technically an accurate characterization of this system, but it's close enough. The 5% is the party bar, not the political person bar.
Oh, okay.
But you're essentially correct. And I think that's an interesting segue into this discussion of, is gerrymandering really an issue of fairness, or is it part of a larger systemic issue of representation? Let me parse that out a little bit. We have this discussion of, a lot of people clamoring for an end to gerrymandering on both sides of the aisle, depending on the decade, saying it's not fair, my party has no chance. Between the two of us, it's not fair because I live in Maryland, I'm a Republican, all of my neighbors are Republican, but we live in a district that always elects a Democrat. It's not fair because I live in Ohio, I'm a Democrat, all of my neighbors are Democrats, but our district always elects a Republican. That is often what we mean in terms of, is it fair? But we've also discussed in this episode what it means to be democratic, little d, democratic representation. And, does a two-party system really account for representation? And Joe, again, always the forethinker of our topics, you touched a little bit on the idea, or pretty heavily on the idea, that perhaps under a system that didn't involve the ability to gerrymander, we might start seeing other third parties in this country, and third parties with a real viable chance. Of course, we have things like the Green Party and the Libertarian Party and whatnot.
I wouldn't even vote for something like that.
Yeah. And we even technically have two senators who are independents, quote unquote, but we all know how they tend to vote in the Senate. So let me rephrase, and hopefully we'll cut this out.
I'm not going to cut it.
Fair. So, when we deal with the idea of democratically representative, are we conceding that gerrymandering is a symptom of a system that is not democratically representative? Or are we saying that there's a possibility that we could fix gerrymandering, keeping our system, and increase democratic representationalism?
I think obviously there's a chance for us to fix the system without reworking it towards proportional representation or another radical solution. The problem is that the underlying causes of gerrymandering are partisan politics, kind of two-party politics especially, the idea that once a single party has taken control of a state legislature or the national legislature even, they don't have to make compromises really. They can govern as they see fit. And that, we can introduce a stopgap measure. We can redistrict Virginia, for instance, to make it totally nonpartisan. But next time the Democrats get a wave year, or next time the Republicans get a wave year, and it happens to be around that census year, what's to stop them from institutionally, systematically, from gerrymandering again? And I think the history of the United States, our political history, has shown that the answer is nothing, that we'll continue to do it. And to a certain extent, kind of increased political openness in the past century has reduced the problem somewhat. I mean, we complain about how bad it is in Maryland and Texas, for instance, but nothing compares to the machine politics of Chicago in, the late 1800s. But I think really the ideal solution, for me at least, would be a very radical recasting of the American political system, not a kind of stopgap measure. Now, whether that's practically possible or not, obviously, totally different question.
Right. All right. So before we wrap up and we do our traditional out of the ballpark weirdo question, I want to zoom out just a little bit on, we've discussed increasing fairness, increasing democratic representation, and the many, many methods that are out there that people have proposed. But as sort of a two-part question, are any of them feasible? And if so, where do they come from? Specifically, we've mentioned a couple of outlets of where solutions are already, quote-unquote, coming from. The Supreme Court has been throwing out certain districting maps, but they've not really been offering concrete solutions as to how to change. Meanwhile, certain states, albeit mainly states that have pretty firm control by one party or another in their state legislature, have been implementing commissions or bipartisan institutions that theoretically draw their maps. Where do we think this change could most feasibly come from, and what kind of form do we think it would take?
My inclination is that it would have to come state by state. Like you said, there are already some states which are implementing the idea of a bipartisan commission. And there are, some states are even implementing some of the radical solutions that Jakob is talking about. I believe Maine rolled out was it a ranked voting?
Ranked voting, which is the worst possible compromise between proportional representation and first past the post.
You don't like ranked voting?
I do not.
Blake doesn't like ranked voting either. But the point is, the bottom line is, I don't think the Supreme Court is ever going to come to a solid decision which will end gerrymandering nationally, and a constitutional amendment, that's a joke. So there's really no other place for it to come from. That's what I think.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to see more bipartisan commissions. I think the Democrats in the Virginia State House have thrown their support behind it, and because they're at 50-50 with the Republicans right now, they're going to probably get their way. But there's no real systematic solution, not a realistic one.
All right. In that case, I do have a random question for you all prepared, but before we get to that, I'd just like to remind our listeners that Talking TWAMPs is a member of the podcasting network at William & Mary, and if you're interested in this podcast or in hearing any other podcasts, we encourage you to check them out on iTunes, Google Play, or any other place that you listen to podcasts. I would also like to issue a brief reminder that the opinions expressed on this show are the opinions held by those expressing them and not by the college itself. But we do appreciate you listening to them anyway. Now, if we could go back in the same order that we introduced ourselves, say by sheer political force, proportional representation was forced on the U.S. By and large, not state by state, but by some massive constitutional amendment. Obviously, we're ruling out how impossible that process would be. What do we think the first major party to take seats in Congress would be? The first new major party. So not the Democrats, not the Republicans. What new party seizes seats in the first round of elections after proportional representation is instituted?
In this hypothetical world in which we have this radical change, I think we'd be really highly likely to see sort of like a Bernie Sanders-esque, like neo-Marxist, neo-democratic socialist party springing up from sort of like the urban centers that we see like propping up all over California, Seattle, Washington. I think those people would have at least a significant minority in the federal legislature, which could then, galvanize itself and, probably stake out a more permanent position within the federal legislature.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with George. There's already a clear dividing line in the Democratic Party where that could emerge. Of course, I don't know what he means by neo-democratic socialists. Democratic socialists are a modern political movement. But yeah, I think that's really
debatable.
I think that is really a realistic outcome.
I mean, the Soviets claim to be democratic as well, but
since you guys have taken the good one, I'm gonna have a really hot take and say the United Utah Party, or perhaps a national coalition of sort of center-right Mitt Romney types, who would be competitive, I think, in Utah and a number of suburban districts once separated from the Republican Party as a whole. But really, across the board, I think the conclusion is proportional representation would result in more ideological diversity in Congress.
Wow, no love for the libertarians here. Even chancing the ability at seats. Well, again, thank you everybody for listening, and thank you to all the contributors for being here today. Bye, guys.